My free history. In the sources about the Janissaries' way of fighting, I came about a contradiction which I want to discuss in this video. The topic of today is all about one thing: were the Janissaries able to fire volleys? The author who most explicitly negates the Janissaries' use of volleys is Nicole. The Janissaries never used musketry in massed volleys, relying instead on individual skills and marksmanship. Depiction is more specific about the situation. According to proponents of the military revolution theory, musketry volley fire was among the military innovations that fundamentally altered early modern field warfare. The origins of European volley fire date back to the 1590s, but no Western army, with the possible exception of the Dutch in 1600, was able to use this tactic in action until the 1620s. Furthermore, it has been thus far assumed that the Ottomans failed to adopt this new tactic and thus experienced setbacks in the face of their European adversaries during this period. So according to Depiction, Nicole's view seems to be quite common. Parker confirms this by quoting the former Turkish commander in Hungary. Despite its abundant human and natural resources and the services of some renegade European experts, in 1602 the Turkish commander in Hungary complained that his troops could no longer match the firepower of the Christian adversaries. In the field or during a siege we are in a distressed position, because the greater part of the enemy forces are infantry armed with muskets, while the majority of our forces are horsemen, and we have very few specialists armed with muskets. Western improvements in volley fire and the multiplication of field guns widened the gap. We should note here that Parker sees the lack of volley fire only as a minor factor in the repeated defeats the Ottomans suffered, especially from the end of the 17th century onwards. Nevertheless, the question is who is wrong and who is right. Luckily, Günhan Berekci, whom I've quoted above, wrote nearly 30 pages elaborating on this question. He makes a bold claim. Ottoman sources, however, prove that the Janissaries were already using volley fire by 1605 and possibly before. Considering that European armies used this tactic in action only after the 1620s, the chronicle of Abdülkadir Efendi apparently reports the first recorded battlefield use of volley fire anywhere in Central Europe. This means that instead of failing to adapt to modern European tactics, the Ottomans would be the first to develop and use them. Berekci supports this with the following quote: "And in the middle of the field the Janissary regiments stood in 3 ranks, each musketeer with matches ready to fire, and they lined up the big cannons chained in front of the Janissaries. Then, after the first rank of the Janissaries fires the muskets, the second rank fires too. Afterwards, the rank that fired first bends double and begins to reload their muskets. And as the third rank fires, the second rank in front of them bends and prepares their muskets. Then the first rank again stands up and fires their muskets." This description by the chronicler Abdülkadir is strikingly similar to what one would understand under the term volley firing. Abdülkadir probably was an eyewitness to the Battle of Mohawks. Berekci uses 2 paintings to further underline his thesis. The first miniature is an image that illustrates a text of the poet Nadiri. The relevant poem is dated to 1605 and is said to describe a battle close to Nicopolis against the rebellious voivode of Wallachia in 1598. In the lower right corner we see soldiers wearing the burg. This suggests that they are Janissaries. The front rank is kneeling and firing, while the second rank is also kneeling but reloading. Note that each rank acts in unison, which suggests the firing of volleys. The enemy is also trying to act in unison, although much less orderly. The next miniature is very similar to the case before, although it is even older. It is from 1558 and probably depicts the Battle of Mohawks in 1526. In the lower left corner of this miniature we can see 2 ranks of soldiers wearing the typical Janissaries burg. The front rank is kneeling and reloading, while the second rank is firing. In this case, the Ottoman sources as well as Berekci describes what is happening here as firing by ranks. Let's look at a comparison of both pictures. The depiction of the Janissaries, their ranks and their way of reloading and firing are very similar in both pictures. If someone showed these miniatures to me and asked me what I saw, I probably would answer that they depict soldiers firing volleys, since the Janissaries seem to act in unison. This clearly supports Barekci's views. Nevertheless, there's one thing I do myself that makes me wonder if this is really the case. When I try to symbolize ranks of Janissaries, I simply use copy and paste. When looking at the other soldiers in the picture, these are also very similar. Just look at the enemies in the top left corner. The same holds for the other picture. Look at the two Janissaries in the center. Although the one holds something that seems like a musket and the other a bow, the outline of the soldiers is nearly the same. Only the pattern of the clothing is painted differently. The same holds for the riders. Is this because the outline of people as well as the posture is very similar in general? Is it the military formation? Or is the painter just making his life easier? Could it be that the artist copied his figures just like I do and then added different details to everyone? This makes me wonder if something that seems like firing by rank or even volley firing could be due to the artist's desire for efficiency. Then there is another point. The first picture is mostly described as volley firing, while in the second case Barekci tends more to describing it as firing by ranks. Firing by ranks would mean a deep line, where the foremost soldier fires his gun and then wanders back and reloads while his comrades deliver their shot one after another. The ranks in this picture are clearly not deep enough for this kind of system to work. Volley firing would mean that up to 3 ranks would close up and fire their guns simultaneously or at least by row. In this case, the first rank had to kneel, which is what we see in both pictures. In the end, if one picture shows the firing by rank technique, so does the other. The same holds for the case of volley firing. For me, the pictures clearly tilt in the direction of volley fire, although it could also be that the painter tried to economize on his time and painted every file the same, while in reality the soldiers just fired by rank and thereby produced a rain of bullets, although not in unison. We have to take into account another possibility. The quote we heard was from a chronicler of the Sultan. This means he had a big incentive to describe his famous battle under the command of the ruler as perfectly executed by a corps of highly disciplined troops with modern weapons. The same holds for the artists. Whatever they documented, it is not 100% trustworthy. In addition, if the Ottomans actually were the first to use volley fire, there is the open question why no one documented it. Since this firing technique proved to be the most useful for firearms, every enemy should have analyzed it. The same holds for the paintings. Should there not be much more miniatures than 2? There's one point which favors Nicole's claim that the Janissaries never used volley fire. It is all about the character of the corps. A testimonial by Baron de Tott tells us the following. In 1770, the French Baron de Tott was invited to modernize the Ottoman army and he tried to get the Turks to use bayonets. But this weapon was anathema to the individualistic Janissaries who realized that it could only be effective if wielded by men acting in unison, or as the Janissaries saw it, fighting like robots rather than warriors. Volley fire, as well as firing row by row, had similar demands on acting in unison. So these two stories fit together, although I think that the word robot must be a very free translation. However, I think this description of the Janissaries' character is puzzling. Just remember how the training of the Janissaries tried to make them into a group and enable social pressure. The whole myth of the Janissaries is about strict discipline. This absolutely contradicts such words like individualistic. Of course, the situation of Baron de Tott was more complicated. We are talking about the year 1770. At this time, the Janissaries had hardly any military value left, but probably were deeply concerned about keeping their privileges. The reforms which de Tott was supposed to institute were directed against the Janissaries. It would be only natural for them to reject any of his ideas as stupid and unscientific. I meant unmilitary. Additionally, the name Baron de Tott is controversial, and some sources implicitly describe him as an arrogant European looking down on the poor Ottomans. It could very well be that he just failed in teaching the army. Nevertheless, a statement by Augustin regarding Ottoman guns could provide additional insight on the bayonet. In the butt of the weapon there was a steel knife, which could be used if the enemy attacked the gunner after he fired his gun and thus was vulnerable. While the Ottomans were late in introducing the bayonet en masse, the above information indicates that the vulnerability of the gunner after he had fired his weapon, mainly the swift cavalry charges, was a concern among the Ottomans, and that they experimented with possible countermeasures. This means the Ottomans were very much aware of a problem which the bayonet could have solved. So why not use the bayonet? Of course, they might even have not been too expensive, but military history is full of situations where better equipment was not issued for financial reasons. At least some Janissaries had the steel knives anyway, and others would even carry sabers. Another factor might have been the malted use of guns the Ottomans used. The expenditure necessary to get bayonets fitting to every type of gun would have simply been impossible. The usage of sabers might even explain the view of bayonets as not warrior-like. Just consider how long this weapon was a symbol of status in the West when it already had lost any value on the battlefield. A final volley fired in unison was more often than not used merely as the preliminary to a clash of swords, hatchets and halberds, or the launching of spears which typified the fighting in close quarters. This tells us that the Janissaries preferred the saber or similar weapons in melee anyways. Nicole describes other occurrences which back up the individualistic combat style of the Janissaries. The men shot from a great distance, according to a French observer, and held their guns with one hand. The Janissaries' enemies also noted that Ottoman marksmen could shoot accurately by moonlight, while the speed and accuracy of Ottoman musketry still amazed the Austrians in the late 17th century. I've never shot a Janissary gun. Nevertheless, I do remember what I said about these muskets in an earlier video. They had a length of at least 110 centimeters and a weight of at minimum 3 kg. Most guns were longer and heavier. The biggest had a length of 160 centimeters and a weight of 4.5 kg. Even if in this shooting exercise the smallest guns were used, I can hardly imagine firing them one-handed and with any accuracy. I think those descriptions either come from an observer who got to see a demonstration for which only the best shots were picked, like I have experienced myself once, or it is propaganda trying to exaggerate the abilities of an enemy. The claim about shooting in the moonlight seems to point in this direction. Whichever position you take, Augustin does not seem to see the question of volley fire or not as very important. One should also be careful not to overstate the importance of the Janissaries' volleys and consider the destructiveness of archers, whose arrows could cause more damage among the enemy than muskets. He's absolutely right here. Leinen extensively discusses how bows were more accurate, had a higher range as well as a higher rate of fire. But gunpowder, especially in those times, had an extreme psychological impact. A hit was almost always lethal. Guns of the mid-16th century were incredibly loud and sprayed smoke and fire with each shot. Compared to a silent bow that soldiers had seen for thousands of years, a gun was absolutely terrifying. While the gunner could miss due to the gun's low accuracy and range, he would still succeed in defeating his opponent by taking away his heart for battle. If battle constituted hell on earth, then why not fire and brimstone? At this point we have to look back to an earlier video, where we discussed the tasks the Janissaries had in battle. It was the job to stop an attacking enemy and pin him down until the cavalry could crush them from the flanks. The Janissaries' task was not to kill as many enemies as possible. They were not skirmishers, accurately picking out enemies at a great distance, but a compact block of infantry, which had to stop any attack, cause chaos and disable any resistance to the mounted troops. Therefore, the usage of muskets, especially volley firing, is most critical. Storming into a rain of arrows is dreadful, but storming into a thunder of smoke and unseen lead is pure horror. This probably is a good place to take a look at what we learned today. The military revolution theory tries to explain why Europe became dominant in the world. Its answer is that among other factors, new military tactics developed in Europe. One of them was the firing of volleys. The question is if the Ottomans participated in this development. Only newer sources claim that the Ottomans not only were able to fire volleys, but might have been the first to employ this new tactic. Günhan Berekci spent nearly 30 pages elaborating on this issue. He presents a quote from around 1620. In this, the Ottoman chronicler Abdülkadir describes how the Janissaries deployed in 3 ranks. Each rank delivered a volley in turn. In addition, he presents the 2 miniatures you can see here. We have discussed them thoroughly. I came to the conclusion that the paintings can easily be interpreted as Janissaries delivering volleys. That does not necessarily mean that what we see here really did happen. That the soldiers are near copies of each other could be due to the painter striving for efficiency. Pictures could very well depict only fire by ranks and not volleys. It could also be that the painters and the chroniclers had the implicit task to show the Ottoman troops as capable and therefore describe the most modern and impressive tactics. Then there is the question if the general character of the Janissaries fitted volley firing. Fighting with bayonets is a similar case to firing volleys. Both demand acting in unison. The Janissaries rejected bayonets when Baron de Tott tried to train them because, as they claimed, this would take away their individualistic fighting style and turn them into automatons. The Janissaries refusing to use bayonets is a resolute contradiction to them firing volleys. Furthermore, the accounts of the Janissaries' shooting skills focus mainly on marksmanship, which is exactly what volleys are not. So, what is my conclusion to all of those contradictions? We should remember that there were many authors which probably had different abilities. Over time, the Janissaries changed very much too. All in all, I would guess that the better units of the Janissaries were able to deploy volley firing, especially before the decline, and maybe would have even been able to use bayonets. The miniatures and stories are probably about those units. If not in battle, these troops could be used for the open display of the skills to high-ranking officials. However, volley firing demands training, drill and discipline, and in the later times of the Ottoman Empire, those were not guaranteed at all. And then you are left to the option to gather some peasants and let them fire their guns randomly instead of intimidating enemies by firing horrific volleys. In the end, the whole discussion if the Janissaries were able or unwilling to use volley firing comes down to one question. Was it volley or folly? Now it's your turn again. In this discussion there are a lot of rabbit holes to go down. Can you add something to this discussion? Maybe you even have additional sources. So long, we'll meet again in 2 weeks. Stay critical, stay curious, stay free.